Okay guys, so we're out here on the water today, and of course we are here to do the casting impressions video of the JDM Shimano SLX DC to see what this thing can do, if it's worth all the hype and curiosity that everybody has about this reel. Now I have the reel mounted on the Shimano Bantam 6'8" medium. I have 12-pound mono instead of the usual 10. And basically we're just going to test out all the brake settings to see what they do, because as I explained in the previous video, Shimano Japan didn't really give us any kind of line mode settings like the American version of the SLX DC has. So I'm going to be casting around and hopefully making some observations and sharing that with you guys. But the lure I have tied on is the Lucky Craft Gunfish. I believe it's the 95 or something like that. It's about 3/8 of an ounce. And I'm going to set the spool tension to just minimize the side-to-side play. Now, luckily, there was I guess a Japanese viewer that saw my tabletop video of this reel, and he translated those Japanese instructions. And go to the comment section of the video and check him out. But when it came to spool tension, I'm pretty sure he said that Shimano Japan said you can adjust it however you need it. So I'm assuming if you're getting backlashes and overruns, you can adjust the spool tension. But I'm gonna set it up to just minimize the side-to-side play to start out with. And we're gonna start out in brake setting number 4. And hopefully there's no trees behind me. All right, I'm just gonna do some easy casting, let the line settle. And here we go. Oh, crap. Let me make sure that was on 4. Yep, that was on 4. So the lure went out farther than I expected, but the spool was faster than I expected as well. So I had an overrun there, it looks like on the back half of the cast. All right, so that was brake setting number 4, and it looks like I had an overrun just on an easy sidearm cast. I'm gonna do a couple more of those. All right, looks like it looks like there was no overrun that time around. I'm gonna do a few more casts. So I guess the line needed to settle, or the brake unit is adjusting itself, but I put a little bit more effort into that cast and it went out there probably almost 100 feet. Okay, so I really put some effort into that sidearm cast, and on brake setting number 4, this thing is bombing. Now, I know with the American version, brake setting number 4 would definitely not cast that far. All right, we'll do a couple more sidearm before I do some overhead. So I'm definitely just gonna have to let the brakes do the work and then use my thumb to stop the spool when the lure hits the water. All right, one more sidearm. Man, that is going out there. So that was a bad cast by me. Had a slight overrun there at the end of the cast. Okay, so let's do some overhead. So that's going out there probably at least 45 yards. Now just imagine with 10-pound line what this thing can do. But so far, yeah, Shimano definitely have not disappointed with this JDM SLX DC, because they said it's made for long casting, yet overrun control. All right, a couple more and then I'm really gonna heave one out there. All right, now that was more of a rainbow cast with a high arc, and the spool was still very controlled. Okay, let's do a really long cast now. Oh shit. Okay, I hope I didn't blow the spool up so bad that I can't pick this backlash out. But yeah, the distance was probably about 45 yards. I think the lure might have tumbled through the air, causing this overrun. Gonna have to work on my release point there to get it to fly straight. All right, let's try again. Oh, okay, that was better. Now that was more of a line drive cast that seemed to fly straight through the air, no tumbling. So the spool control was perfect. I was just too slow with my thumb. And this is just on brake setting number 4. Let me make sure, yep, it's on 4. So that was probably equal to what the American SLX DC could do in its braid and mono mode. All right, let's do one more. I'm not gonna try to do a line drive arc cast just to see how far we can get. Okay, so distance still right around the 45-yard mark, I'd say. And once again, hopefully you guys can see where this is landing. I picked a spot where the water is dark, and that kind of helps you guys see where the lures land. All right, one more long cast, and then we're gonna turn the brakes down to 3. Okay, so distance is about the same on every cast, but that's still a very impressive distance, especially on the allegedly max brake setting. Turn the brake dial to 3. I'm gonna be careful. I don't wanna blow the spool up to where I can't pick the backlash out and the video is over. But let's do some sidearm on brake setting 3. All right, so that seemed to be pretty controllable. Ooh. Okay, so put a little more effort into that cast and I saw some overrun, and maybe the DC will adjust itself on the next cast, but yeah. Now the problem with the American version SLX DC, at least when I did the casting impressions video of it, was that it was very inconsistent, at least with a loose spool tension setting. So it would overrun probably, I would say, half the time, which is very un-DC like. And that is in the braid mono mode using mono. Now with fluorocarbon mode, it seems to behave perfectly, but okay, let's see if the DC unit will adapt. All right, seemed like it. Now it could be the fact that the lure is cutting through the air a little bit better, but I'd like to think that the DC unit is adapting. Now the distance is about the same as setting number 4. So let's do some overhead and see if we can see if there's a difference in max distance with an overhead cast. I don't really see a difference, maybe 5 foot more, if that. I know the wind did kick up a little bit. It's blowing from left to right. So let's test out how good this reel is into the wind. So I turn it back into the number 4 position. I can feel a good wind coming into me. Perfect, with still awesome distance. Okay, the wind died down a little, but I can still feel it, so let's do an overhead. Perfect. So if the wind is not blowing super hard, the SLX DC in the number 4 brake setting can definitely handle it. Okay, it's blowing really hard now. Perfect. Now usually when it's windy, I always go with a sidearm cast, something low trajectory, but I just did an overhead cast there. Still got about 35 yards and the spool was perfect. So let's go back down to 3 and let's do some long overhead casting now. Well, the distance between 3 and 4 doesn't seem to be much, if at all. I don't really see a difference in the overall distance of the cast using a overhead cast. Let's do a couple more. Oh, there we go. God. So I got a really good cast there, as you can see. It probably went close to 60 yards on that cast, but the spool got unruly there. And what we're gonna do is I'm gonna see if I can duplicate that same cast and see if the brake unit adapts and controls that overrun, and see if I can still get the same distance. But that cast was probably close to 60 yards with a 3/8 ounce topwater Lucky Craft gunfish. All right, let's try it again. Okay, not quite as far, but still about 50 yards on that cast. And the spool was definitely behaved that time. So to me, it seems like the brake unit is adapting. Once I blow the spool up a little bit on the next cast, it seems to solve the problem. All right, one more time, and then we're gonna go to the number 2 setting. All right, so far I actually am impressed with this SLX DC 70. They seem to have definitely given it a different brake tune than the American version. I said the last one was one more, but we're actually gonna do one more. All right, so that was about 50 yards. Spool perfectly controlled. Now I'm trying to angle the reel so you guys can check the spool control out as the lure's flying through the air. Okay, let's go to number 2. Now I kind of briefly scanned that viewer's translation of the brake settings. I didn't really take a good look at it, but there was something about the type of lure for this setting and that setting. But yeah, you guys might want to check that out for yourselves. But here is brake setting number 2. Does seem to cast a little bit more free. No blow up, no overrun. Let's do a couple more sidearm. Damn, that's going probably close to 50 yards with just a nice sidearm swing. All right, let's do one more sidearm. So yeah, number 2 setting definitely casts longer than the 3 and the 4, at least with your average cast stroke. Okay, so let's do an overhead with the number 2 setting. Now this could blow the spool up. I have a feeling it will, but there's one way to find out. And yep, I'm on number 2. So that was kind of a bad cast. That you can see that the overrun, you can see there was a slight overrun that kind of worked its way out towards the tail end of the cast. But let's try again. All right, so distance didn't seem to be that much different than the number 3 setting, but you can definitely see that the spool starts to overrun in the middle of the cast and kind of works itself out. Let's do one more cast and see if I can let you guys see that. All right, so there was like a couple of coils that popped up in the middle of the cast. Hopefully you guys saw, and it immediately was taken care of by the DC brakes. But overall distance on 2 so far does not seem to be any different than 3, and maybe just a little bit farther than setting 4. All right, let's do one more. Okay, so that was probably a 50-yarder, and once again, hopefully you guys saw that the spool had a couple of loops there in the middle of the cast that kind of sorted itself out. And keep in mind, this was with a spool tension setting where there's actually just a slight bit of side-to-side play, and it's a really fast fall. All right, we'll do 2 more to see if brake setting 2 will give us any more distance. All right there was probably close to a 60-yard cast. Now keep in mind, my cast stroke does play a huge role in how far these casts are going and how consistent I can be. All right, one more. All right, so I'm not seeing any overruns in these longer casts, which probably means that the lure is flying a little bit better through the air. All right, break setting number 2. Now let's go down to break setting number 1, which in the American version is the extreme distance mode that they recommend you only use with really heavy, really aerodynamic lures that cut through the air really good, or else you're gonna blow your spool up. So let's do some sidearm. Nope, spools seem pretty fine to me, at least on that cast. It's going out there about 40 to 45 yards. All right, a couple more sidearm. Now I actually watched the lure in the air that time, and I did see it helicopter a little bit, and the spool had a slight overrun that worked itself out. So it's time to do some overhead long bombing and see what this SLX DC can do. JDM version, of course. All right, so I'm getting close to dumping all the line off of this spool. Now, if this was like a 1/2 ounce spook or 5/8 ounce spook, I'm pretty sure I could dump all this line off of this spool with no problem. And once again, this is 12-pound mono instead of the usual 10-pound that I use, because I didn't want to have the line break during these really hard casts. Okay, we got a backwind here, and let's do one more cast. All right, so you see there was a blow up, but nothing too severe. It was probably due to wind and the lure helicoptering, but I don't think that the American version SLX DC can throw this lure in the number 1 setting without blowing the spool up. Okay, now here's a nice wind coming from left to right, and we'll see if the number 1 brake setting can handle it. Nope, it can't. And this is a bad one. Okay, so luckily I was able to pick that backlash out. It took about 5 minutes, but now we know that you don't use the number 1 brake setting casting into a moderate headwind. Okay, I'm gonna do a couple more sidearm. Oh, and the spool wants to blow up. And this one is bad too, damn. Okay, so I was finally able to pick that backlash out, and let's do a couple more casts. Now there's a wind coming in, so I'm gonna do a sidearm and see how it reacts this time. Nope, does not like wind in the number 1 brake setting, whether it be overhead or sidearm. But this backlash is not that bad, thankfully. Okay, so the wind seems to be changing direction and coming directly into me, but I'm gonna continue casting. Yep, bad idea. I was trying to do a super low trajectory sidearm cast and still just not enough brake. So definitely in the wind, do not use brake setting 1. Okay guys, so I'm gonna cast a couple more times overhead in the number 1 brake setting before we switch over to a much lighter lure to see how the reel can handle that. So yeah, I think that 3/8 ounce with, you know, a lure that can really fly through the air very well, it's probably going to be the limit for the number 1 brake setting. You could probably do maybe a 1/2 ounce, 5/8 ounce top water with this, and it'll be heavy enough and cut through the air good enough to be able to consistently cast without an overrun. But let's do a couple more. All right, one more cast. Yep, number 1 with this lure is consistently overrunning. Not super bad, but it's something you can probably dial out by tightening up the spool tension or just using your thumb to feather the spool. But let's switch over to a lighter lure now. Okay guys, we have switched up to a smaller version of the Lucky Craft Gunfish. This is, I believe, the 75, which weighs about 3/16 of an ounce, around 5 grams if I'm not mistaken. So about half the weight of the previous lure. And we're gonna cast this lure in all brake modes and see what's up. Now it does seem to load up fairly well. Now once again, I would normally use 10 pound for this test, but this is 12 pound, and that could affect the distance for sure. But I've switched the brakes to brake setting number 4, and let's see what's up. All right, that's definitely a doable distance, probably about 25 yards. It's a nice easy sidearm cast. Spool perfectly controlled, no issues whatsoever. It's consistently going the same distance. All right, let's do some overhead. All right, that was a nice rainbow cast. Let's see if I could do a line drive. All right, so we're probably getting about another extra 5 foot of distance with an overhead cast, but spool still controlled. Now with lighter line, I'd estimate this reel could easily handle probably upper end bait finesse, possibly, on the appropriate rod, of course. All right, the wind is definitely kicking up, and let's try to cast this light lure into the wind. No problem at all. Hopefully you guys saw that. That was a sidearm cast, but light lures into the wind definitely is usually a problem. Let's do overhead now. Distance is still good, probably about 75 to 80 feet. All right, let's go to the number 3 setting. Ooh, I saw some loops there. The distance did go up, probably hitting 100 foot or close, but the spool did start to overrun and it did feel faster. All right. Okay, so the spool is perfectly controlled now. I think that's because the wind has died down a little bit. We are definitely getting more distance with this light lure on brake setting 3 versus brake setting 4. All right, let's do some overhead. Yeah, we're probably reaching close to 100 feet. Just a couple more overhead. Oh yeah, that was well over 100 foot in my estimation. All right, one more. All right, so remember, this is a roughly 3/16 ounce lure, maybe a little bit over that, but fairly lightweight for 12 pound line. All right, let's go to number 2. All right, with a nice sidearm cast, you're probably looking at around 100 foot, maybe a little bit more. No spool control issues. All right, let's do some overhead. Now it's perfectly calm now. Oh yeah, that's hitting well over 100 foot in my estimation. All right, one more and then we're gonna drop the brakes down to number 1. All right, a couple of loops there, probably because my cast was somewhat awkward, but it worked itself out. All right, let's go to number 1. Ooh, Distance was awesome, but the spool, as you can see, blew up. Now that was kind of an awkward cast. I think I snapped my wrist a little too much at the end, and you can see it kind of went off to the left. All right, let's do some nice smooth cast strokes. Oh, still blew up, but the distance was good. Okay, so I probably know the outcome of this, but we're gonna do some overhead cast in the #1 brake setting. Yeah, the spool exploded. So I think this lure is just too light for the #1 brake setting. But it looks like you can go all the way down to the #2 brake setting with no problem. And I'm sure with a more appropriately powered rod, something lighter, it would do better. But still very impressive for such a light lure that's at the upper end of bait finesse in my opinion, at least for bass. Okay, so now that we know that the spool will blow up in the #1 setting for this lure, no matter if I do overhead or sidearm, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to see if I can cure that overrun by tightening the spool tension. And we're going to set it up the old school Shimano way by tightening it up and loosen it so that the lure falls slow, and when it hits the water, it's a couple of loops like so. Might be a little too loose still, but we're gonna work with that and see if that cures the overruns in the #1 brake setting. It cured it a little bit. It's not as severe as before, that's for sure, but the distance was still pretty good, probably about 90 feet. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna tighten it up just a little bit more and see if that will cure that overrun. So the lure hits the water and there is no backlash at all. So let's see if that will cure the overrun now. Yep, sure did, and distance looks to be roughly the same. Oh, overrun in the middle of the cast that sorted itself out. So it looks like the DC brakes are definitely adjusting a little bit. So where these overruns are fixing themselves towards the end of the cast. I'm sure you can go tighter than that, but I think this is tight enough. So basically, in my opinion, tightening the spool tension in brake setting 1 is really not going to get you anything that you can't get in brake setting 2 with a loose spool tension. So as I've said to certain fanboys in comment section, if you loosen up one thing, you got to tighten up another. But sidearm seems to be very well behaved.